So, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, and welcome to this event. And before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. So, this call will be recorded. Please note that this going to be shared with the ones who are unable to attend, and I might also upload it to the YouTube channel. Second thing is if you can keep your background noise, minimize your background noise and keep your microphones muted unless you want to speak, of course, and you are welcome to keep your cameras off or on as you prefer. And for the questions, we will have a Q&A session after the presentation, and you can either raise your virtual hand to ask a question or verbally or type your question in the chat, and I will be monitoring both, and we will make sure that your questions are addressed. So now I'm pleased to introduce Jane, who will be chairing this session today. So Jane, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Albina. So welcome everybody to this Notes from the Field. And it's an initiative that was created by Soros Poya and others in the alumni network. And we really want to thank them for taking it forward. Just to say who I am, I'm Jane Corbett, and this year, since September, this academic year, I've been part of the MPhil team, replacing Chris Sambrook, who, as most of you will probably know, is away on sabbatical. Not that anybody can replace him, really, but very, very glad to have been working with Howard Nelson this year in terms of directing and the programme and making sure everything goes as smoothly as possible. So my background is in the field of leadership development, systems thinking and social innovation. And of course, those are things that there is a lot happening on during the course of the MPhil. So it's been a very exciting year working with the 21 students in this year's cohort from 18 nationalities. But now I'd really like to introduce Al Jones, who's an alumnus from 2017, 2018. And he's going to be talking about a very important topic, restoring landscapes under the voluntary carbon market. And of course, with everything that's been happening and the complexities of the carbon market and the challenges and the opportunities, there's a lot to be said and updated on. And we're really grateful Al's taking a landscape level perspective on this. So we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Al. Over to you.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. I'll just get my screen working. Okay, hi everyone. So as Jane said, I'm going to be talking about my experiences and key lessons working in the voluntary carbon market. So I've been in this space for about the last 4 years and working on large landscape scale restoration projects. So in the thousands of hectares across Asia Pacific and Latin America. I'm also going to touch on how I've been working with multinational corporations and guiding them to implement projects on the ground and what it takes to go through that process. And then look at some of the kind of experiences and major challenges I've found in developing projects globally. And then look at the end around what are some of the pathways and experiences I've had around equitable benefit sharing and how to move forward in this space. So just quickly, for those of you who don't know a little bit about the voluntary carbon market, so it started back in about the 1990s and has been evolving ever since. It, as the name suggests, is a large-scale market that's unlocking capital directed to a variety of different project types. So one of those is afforestation, reforestation, and restoration, which is the predominant focus of my work. But there are also other types like landfill gas and cook stoves that have been a big part of the voluntary carbon market as well. So obviously it's very different to the compliance market, which is dictated by governments and required by corporates. Voluntary, as the name suggests, means that corporates and others are contributing off their own back to meet a variety of different commitments, mainly around net zero targets, signing up to SBTi targets as well. So the ultimate outcome is verified reductions in the form of credits, and there are a number of different standards that go through this process. So you might have heard of VERA, Voluntary Carbon Standard, or the Gold Standard, or Climate Action Reserve. And the aim is to encourage sustainable land use and foster biodiversity and socioeconomic outcomes. So it's been a really interesting time, particularly the last 2 years. There's been a lot of negative press on the market in particular. And a lot of it has been warranted in terms of impacts on Indigenous people, local communities, and overcrediting. And I'll touch on that a bit as we go through the presentation. But the fact is the market is continuing to grow, and the estimates are that it's going to be worth 30 to 50 billion by 2030. And that nature-based solutions, particularly restoration of ecosystem, is going to play a huge part of that. So one of the key lessons I want to touch on first is about the role of corporations. And so over the last 4 years have experienced working with a lot of different multinationals, and they play a pivotal role in driving investment into restoration under the VCM. But there's been a lot of changes in how they approach the market, and their willingness to pay is really determined by risk. So how do they engage with the market? There's a few different ways that corporates are active in this space. And one which I'll touch on in more detail next is proprietary projects. So corporates are getting in early, they're investing in developers to go out and source projects from the ground up. They will pay to deliver on feasibility studies and then all the way through the project life cycle. And then they will pay for implementation, with their return being generation of credits, which they retire on the whole. The other is around joint ventures. So there's joint ventures that take place where a few corporates get together and invest on a project. They diversify the risk and they split the credit share as well. Another big one is these impact funds. So that multiple corporates will come together and they will pool their resources on a portfolio of nature-based solutions and restoration projects. You might have seen this with the Symbiosis Coalition, which recently got launched, which is Meta, Google, Salesforce, all coming together to source 20 million tonnes by 2030, all coming from nature-based solutions and carbon removals. And then there's the classic just purchasing credits off the spot market. So what's really been interesting in the last probably 12 to 18 months is how these engagement has changed. So interestingly, investment in the voluntary carbon market is actually increasing companies' decarbonisation ambitions. But the ones that are involved in the market are more likely to decarbonise across their other scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. As I said before, the negative media is resulting in some direct pullback in investment and really dialed in increased due diligence on projects and partners who are developing projects on the ground. And there's on a whole general less appetite for risk. So what that means is that investors and corporates are coming in later in the piece once a full feasibility has been done, once full due diligence has been completed, and they can be confident their investment is going to be sound. The current willingness to pay is increasing, but it's still low below what is typically needed for restoration. It's sitting around the $10 to $15 US tonne, whereas estimates are saying for restoration, we need that up around 50 or above. There's a huge gap there in terms of what the cost and price should be. And as I said, there's an increasing shift to credits from restoration and nature-based solutions removals. So that is essentially tree planting, drawing carbon down, as opposed to REDD+, which is keeping carbon standing in existing forests. There's been a 62% decrease in the value of REDD+ in the last year alone. And then this graph just shows that there's a couple of really big players. There's usually 25 major corporate players that are purchasing the bulk of credits, ranging from Delta Airlines all the way through to the likes of Nestle, who I'm going to talk about right now. So the last 3 years, I've been working with Nestle on their global reforestation program. So the Global Reforestation Program is seeking to plant 200 million trees by 2030 and sequester about 2 million tonnes of carbon. So it's been a really interesting and enlightening experience going through this process with them. So initially it was working with them in this phase 1, so conceptualizing what this actually looks like for Nestlé. And a lot of that was mapping their sourcing region and helping them with others develop a Scope 3 removals framework. So what that means is they had a series of zones within their sourcing region where the ingredients come from, so cacao and coffee, and they want to tie it as closely as possible to that supply chain. So zone 1, for example, means a project that would be on a Nestlé farm, and then the projects range all the way out to zone 4, which is kind of in the general landscape. And then it goes through this really detailed process of feasibility studies, contracting, implementation and monitoring, and then finally long-term monitoring of carbon over, there's a very long contract, 30 years, and very large-scale projects. So we're talking 10 million trees, 5,000 hectares plus. Interestingly, the kind of scope has been shifting as they've got more experience in this space. So their more recent investments are now based on risk profiles, so socio-political risk, economic risk, and particularly risk to reputation as well is a big one for not only Nestlé, but for a lot of other corporates. There's also inclusion of a readiness phase, they're terming it. So it sits between feasibility study and the phase 3, which is contracting. And this is really about due diligence and making sure that there's a robust due diligence process completed. It's very clear what the governance is. Stakeholder engagement is fully completed before they will fund implementation and the planting of and restoration of ecosystems. So one of the other key lessons I've learned as I've been working on these really large scale restoration projects is one around climate risk. So climate change is already clear and present. It's impacting the success of the restoration projects, and it's upending how we think about carbon permanence and carbon claims as well. So for context, permanence is one of the key criteria under the global carbon standards. Essentially means that what you plant now should be existing 30, 40, 50 years down the track. So as I said, this is having some huge impacts because we already have a lot of climate change impacts baked into the system. So the last 12 months, we've hit over 1.5 degrees, exceeded it already. And that impacts how we expect trees to remain in the ground because there's issues around drought, precipitation, wildfire risk as well. And there are existing mitigation methods within the standards themselves, like buffer pools. So a certain percentage needs to be set aside of credit per project in the event of a natural disaster or loss of forest. And what tends to happen is that the projects are very good at this site-specific, I would call it, climate mitigation. So bushfire planning, fire breaks, trying to ensure the integrity of their forests. What has been interesting from my view is that if we look holistically around the project life cycle, there's a lot more that could be done in terms of including climate resilience into the planning. And I worked on this paper a couple of years ago with other colleagues from UNEP WCMC, where we looked at what does that involve in terms of climate resilient restoration. And so it comes down to things like when you're setting your goals, making sure you're including the current climate change impacts, thinking about the site selection at a landscape level, how are climate models likely to impact that in terms of connectivity? Are there areas that are not going to be eligible anymore just because the drought levels are going to be too high in 30 years' time? Those types of items we really need to look at. And then adaptive management in particular is a huge one. I feel like this isn't restricted to the voluntary carbon market. I feel like in a lot of conservation, it's talked about adaptive management, but doing it well is difficult and getting the finance to do it well as well. At least under the carbon market, there is budget to be able to do that management, but aligning it with climate models. And finally, just thinking about species selection as well is a big one. So particularly here in Australia, there's been a lot of work on selecting genetic variants that are more drought tolerant, so they are going to survive down the track from now. And one of the other major lessons, and this I think is where a lot of the criticism has come from to the market, is around Indigenous people and local communities. And I've got two, I guess, key lessons that I've really experienced over the last 4 years. The first one is around land tenure and how it impacts project viability. So land tenure is unclear in a lot of cases in the Global South, or land parcels are far too small to be aggregated together and meet what's required of the global carbon standards. And it's limiting access to carbon finance in a lot of areas where it's probably needed most. So, for example, I worked on developing this project in Tarapoto in Peru. It was a 5 million tree project. It was with a range of small scale farmers, so over 2,000 of them. Often they only have an average hectare plot size of 1 hectare. So very, very small. And trying to demonstrate land tenure and property rights was extremely difficult. So in Peru, there's a mechanism called the agroforestry concession, which government offers a renewable contract to farmers for 40 years. But still over 70% of Indigenous peoples and these farming communities lack irrefutable proof of their property rights, which is a key component of a carbon standard. You need to be able to demonstrate legal right and the transfer of carbon rights as well. And so without that, you cannot access, or the project was not able to go forward. There were other issues with this one too, in terms of just monitoring. So how do you monitor and report and verify not only carbon, but other outcomes across such a disparate number of landholders? And there are steps being put in place to address these issues. So there's new standards emerging, like there's the ecosystem restoration standard, which deliberately targets smallholder farmers. There's also evolving digital monitoring, reporting and verification. And there's things like the global platform of Indigenous and community lands, which I'll go through now. So basically on the right is the global platform. It's a really helpful tool that has been built out. This is for that same area in Peru. And you can see in the brown, it shows community and Indigenous owned lands that are government recognized. And interestingly, it also shows, it's a bit hard to see, but there's yellow dots which show the same lands, but they're not government recognized, but they are still Indigenous lands. And so this is a really helpful resource to enable people to understand where land rights are and how tenure exists in a region. And then on the monitoring side, really evolving in this space is satellite and remote imagery. So now we've got down to 1 meter resolution. We can see individual trees. It means that you can monitor the growth of those trees across a variety of different land parcels. Really reduces the cost, reduces the resource intensivity that's needed, and it's supported by on-ground ground truthing as well. They're really important paths forward to be able to enable smallholder farmers in particular to engage in the voluntary carbon market. Still very much a work in progress though. And so following on from that, the other major lesson, and has been a really big one for me, is around Indigenous people and local community engagement within the voluntary carbon market. So to date, I feel like it's really struggled to work for Indigenous people and local communities. And I'll give some examples. So with the voluntary carbon market and IPLCs, it's in a really interesting space at the moment. So involvement is often still pretty post hoc. So what I mean by that is it'll be often that, you have a developer or someone who has identified an area. They know it's a good project because they've modeled, say, the carbon sequestration rates. And then they kind of go in and start to develop the project from there with communities, meeting all the requirements, typically of the standards, which require stakeholder engagement. But that's rarely still a bottom-up approach. It's rarely like, it's still someone coming in and going over how you should develop a project. There's been a lot of work on distributive equity or benefit sharing and what's fair. because it is subjective and it's often done at the start of the project. So this is the set amount of credits that a community or Indigenous group will get. That's then every verification event, those credits are sold, the money then is distributed. But it's rarely reevaluated, which I think is changing and needs to change, especially as the market grows and the value of those credits get higher and higher. And it can be wildly variable between the standards. So Plan Viva, for example, has mandated 60% minimum that has to go to communities, but other standards don't have that level. And as I said, like free, prior, informed consent is often at the very beginning when the stakeholder engagement process. But then there needs to be more of it happening beyond that initial kind of implementation and still rolling out across these long 30-year time cycles that are occurring. And finally, distributing benefits on the ground can be really fraught. It can be really difficult to, especially with financial incentives, to distribute them on the ground. You know, there's been stories of like money off the back of a truck, these kind of situations. So that really needs to improve as we go forward, and needs to be transparent and traceable, so that people can understand and fully appreciate that the money is actually going to the communities where these projects are getting set up. So an example of this is a project I worked on in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao in the Philippines. It was a large-scale 8,000 hectare bamboo project with native reforestation as well. Super complicated socio-political context. So they emerged out of about 50 years of conflict with the government. They had been fighting for their independence. They got it in about 2019, I think it was from memory. And now that region is Muslim oriented, so it has a sultan as its leader. It has significant issues around trust of outsiders in particular. And it was just and still security risks as well. So very complex socio-political area. There were also kind of intricacies around it in terms of there were illegal settlers on the land. So a lot of the land where the project was happening was actually owned by the government, but people had been living there for a number of years, but they were still termed illegal settlers. So navigating the complexity of that in terms of benefit sharing and what they get, given that that land was being transferred into a different land use. And then navigating also the power dynamics with a sultan and how that works was extremely challenging. Thankfully, this project is still going forward and has been really positive for that community. But yeah, very difficult kind of transition period and stakeholder engagement and FPIC that needed to happen for that. So I guess on that, you know, from reflecting on that, I was thinking about, well, what are some pathways that can improve on benefit sharing and how IPLCs are actually engaged in the VCM? And I think there's a couple of key things for me. One is there's opportunity to really kind of flip the power dynamic, for want of a better term. So IPLC should be really guiding the if, how, where of these afforestation, reforestation project types under the VCM. And that's a much longer process, right? That is much more like trust building, capacity building, making sure you are engaging from a very early start. But for me, I think that means longer term, you're going to get less conflict, more adoption of the project, and less chance of the forest being removed later down the track if things change for whatever reason that might be. I think there also needs to be a push to develop international agreed norms and standards and models around what benefit sharing looks like in this case, so financial and non-financial. So there needs to be working groups and thinking about how this operates, rather than it being kind of done on the go and on the fly a bit. And again, FPIC needs to be throughout, and the project needs to adapt if things change, and consultation requires that. And And as I said before, that really needs to be some standardized mechanism on actually how to distribute benefits as well. So there's been a fair bit of work on, could blockchain be an option in terms of transparent ledger of funds and how that could roll out on the ground. But also that mechanism and that value of benefits needs to be revisited. So often we sign contracts that are 30 years and it has a locked in amount. But with the way the market's evolving, that needs to be revisited, because we don't want to end up in situations, which has happened. It happened with in Mexico with BP, who was funding a project. I think they went in at about $8, and then it got exposed that, you know, community groups felt like they were getting a very short end of the stick in terms of what benefits they were getting, because 5 years down the track it had gone up to say like $15 a ton. And I think also the final thing is that often we talk about the co-benefits. So there's biodiversity outcomes, there's social outcomes, and social impact monitoring is a really difficult one, and it's often focused around, you know, like job creation or household income. But I think we need to consider what are the bottom-up conceptions of what matters to people, because it's often couched in those terms of jobs, but there's significantly more to what social impact means when it comes to these projects, in my view. So I guess some of those key takeaways and lessons I've really learned are that, you know, VCM holds enormous potential to drive capital towards ecosystem restoration. It's going to continue to grow and expand. Corporates that are investing in this space, they need the market certainty and they seek de-risk project portfolios in particular. We need to get better at embedding current climate change impacts and risk into the full project life cycle, so that we are getting longevity and permanence of these projects down the track. I think more needs to be done on working with local communities and governments so they can define legal right, and so that smallholders and IPLCs can increasingly access carbon markets. Really interesting, just side note, when I was in the Philippines, we also visited the Bukidnon ancestral domain. There was a gentleman there who was a lawyer who spent 2 years of his unpaid time developing up the legal structure and framework for their ancestral domain so that they could be legally recognized. So there's people like that out there that are doing this without support, but it's critical that we provide that support. Again, I'm repeating this, but, you know, bottom-up approach to how these projects are developed would go a long way in addressing some of the major criticisms of the market. And that includes building the capacity of people on the ground so they can speak for themselves. I think there will always be some role for project developers because of the complexities of the market. It's just very difficult to navigate, you know, the standards and how they operate and what's needed. So there's always going to be a need for that. And some partners on the ground too, they don't want to get involved in that, which is fair. They want to do reforestation, they want to do the planting, they want to engage their communities. They don't want to get involved in carbon. They want the help to be able to access the market, but they don't necessarily want to get into the nitty-gritty of how it actually operates. And finally, there just needs to be this continued drive to improve the quality, transparency, and integrity in the market, which I think has been a positive of the criticism recently, is that there has been a number of initiatives set up. So there's the core carbon principles, there's the voluntary carbon market integrity initiative, various different things like that, where the standards have noted they can do better and the market can be improved, and they're actively engaging to do that. So I think that is a real positive. That's it.
So, Al, I really want to thank you so much for packing so much in and your overview of this very complex and fast emerging field. And it was really great that you included a few case studies too, so that we could really get some of the concerns that you were exercising. So now we have about 15 minutes for some questions. And just to remind people, if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and Albina will do the tech magic to bring you on. Or you can post something in a chat message. So I'm wondering who's got a question. I'm not seeing a hand up yet, so I'm going to ask a question. So there are so many points I'd love to ask about, but I'm really going to hone in on your recommendation that we should have standardized mechanisms on benefit sharing. Who do you think should be driving this?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think the standard should play a leading role in this, but also recognizing they're probably not experts in this space either. If people know of of them, I'd love to hear. Because yeah, it's a huge challenge, and I'm not I don't know, to be honest, to your question, who should be driving it. I know it has been interesting, and even working with Nestle, they have raised it before as wanting to engage and understand how this could work. There could be a role for corporates as well, but I probably would advise it setting very independently and separate from that.
Thank you. So I'm seeing that, Louise, you've got your hand up. We can't see your face, but we can see your hand is up.
Louise, if you can just unmute yourself and
Hi. Hi, Alastair. Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great. So I'm Wei-Lin, so I'm working on some, I'm also working on some forest and mangrove restoration project back in China. So thanks, Alastair, for your great talk. So I have a question about site selection. Because you may know that land availability is always a concern. So I wonder what kind of land are you selecting usually to do your to do those projects? Are they degraded forests or used to be farmland? And this is my first question. And my second question is about land use conflict. Did you ever come across any conflict in land use when you are doing the project, as maybe the farmers have a limited amount of land, they might want to use it for agricultural purpose rather than forest restoration? This could be a situation. Did you ever come across this situation? Thanks.
Thanks, Wei-Ling. Yeah, so in answer to your first question, it is degraded land. So there are rules and the standards about where you can do the projects. So it has to have been deforested or forest free for over 10 years is the typical kind of standard. So you can't, like go down and cut a forest down and then replant it and try and get carbon credits out of it. It also has to be where forest would exist. So you can't go in and like plant a grassland and which would have been a native grassland and get credits from it. In answer to your second question, it is one of the big challenges. I think particularly working with someone like Nestle, who, global food supplier, they want to do projects on farms where they source ingredients from, but they're productive farms, right? So they only will usually give up like marginal lands on those farms. And in particular, it's hard to reach the scale they're talking about if you only work on the farmland. So yeah, it's a huge challenge, and it usually means you then are aggregating a lot of farms together to get to the scale you need. But yeah, it is a big challenge.
Yes, and I guess there are all sorts of questions in terms of aggregating farms together and everybody involved agreeing on that. So I can see, Louise, you've still got your hand up. So this is your moment to turn
Louise
your
is in the car. She can't just get to the microphone, but I can
okay.
see Maria has typed some message in the chat, so I will read it out if you want, Maria.
Oh, I can ask, like, I just can't raise my hand. But
that's
yeah,
okay.
essentially the credit price, I was wondering what your experience is with determining what that should be if you're developing a project, and ultimately, you know, that's what it comes down to when you're trying to sell credits. So you know, yes, companies are risk averse, but at some point it's just too expensive. Where is that point? And do you think it's that's kind of something that's changing now? Are companies willing to pay more? And how much should a credit cost, at least in the places where you've worked? Have you worked out what that should be to kind of ensure the elements of integrity that you mentioned?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think Maria, it's changing. So companies are now more willing to invest at a higher price to get outcomes that are not just carbon related. So they're keen on like the biodiversity outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes as well. But it also is really dependent on the company, to be honest. Some are willing to pay quite a high price. Others are still floating around that $10, $15 mark, which is the kind of market spot price. But that is, from my experience, way too low for anything related to reforestation. And it depends on the region, but from where I've worked, you're getting up to, say, Brazil, which is quite an expensive area to work. It's sitting probably around the $35 a ton to get a high quality project in Brazil. In Africa, it's probably sitting around $15, $20 a ton. Just it's lower cost in terms of implementation costs and planting. And so that's kind of where it's sitting at the moment. As I said before, it's tracking towards it needs to be much higher, because reforestation is in itself very expensive exercise to get implementation. So the bulk of the costs come in that first 3 to 5 years, right? When you need to do like all the planting, all the infrastructure, and then there's a long tail end of like carbon monitoring, which is nowhere near expensive. But yeah, I think that's where the current market is sitting at, but it needs to get to a much higher price, especially if they want to be covering off on biodiversity outcomes and socioeconomic outcomes as well. Hope that answered your question.
So let's go on to Harish, who's, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, who has his hand up.
Yeah, it's correct. Hello. Hello.
Yes,
You
we
can hear
can
me,
hear
right?
you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for this opportunity, and it's a wonderful presentation. So I have a question regarding the transparency of voluntary carbon market. When we talk about the carbon market, we know there is a huge gap between the project developer and project practitioners. And and sometimes actually I'm working in the northeastern Himalayas in forest landscape restoration projects, which often leads to the carbon sequestration and voluntary carbon market. So, what is the role of the national agencies or the national government or the multilateral organization to build a trust between the project developer and the practitioner? And how can we make our carbon market more transparent? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great question, Harish. I think it's interesting watching governments at the moment as they are engaging in this space. Many are starting to set precedent around particularly benefit sharing, and so how much money needs to go to communities. There is a lot of work being done on Article 6 in the Paris Agreement as well, around setting up carbon markets within country. I think they definitely need to play a role in pushing transparency in the market, and particularly around developers. Yeah, you would have seen some of the reportings, particularly out of Africa, which have been very eye-opening in terms of what some of the issues that have been happening there. Sorry, I forgot the last half of your question.
Thank you, Jones.
We have one question in the chat. I will read it out because Zarina can't raise her hand. I guess you can just ask, unmute yourself and ask if you want, Zarina. Or I can just read it out. She asks, how do you navigate politics and corruption in the Philippines? She's from the Philippines.
Yeah, wow. That project was very, very challenging. I'll be honest. So it was an interesting case in terms of the Muslim Autonomous region was self-governing, but it kind of still sat under the Filipino government. So we were dealing largely with the Bangsamoro Autonomous region. But it's challenging. And I think that, you know, it was about 2 years in by the time I moved on and was at another role. So I think there will be a lot to look very closely around checks and balances around corruption in that region. I think it's just a super challenging place. I don't really have an easy answer for you. I think it is really, really hard to navigate. I think probably one thing is just spending extra time on that stakeholder engagement process and FPIC in particular.
Yeah. Lovely to see your face, Zarina, and that sounds like a conversation to be continued.
Yeah.
Next, let's turn to Leo. Leo, we're not hearing you. Can you turn your mic on?
Yep. Sorry. Thank you very much for the amazing presentation. My question is more about digital and AI-based MRV tools. So these are the things that are more like a recent development, but have you used them in your projects? And then if so, like how did it go?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of movement in this space. I think the standards are trying to catch up to use them as well, because as I said, they're a really useful tool when you're aggregating a lot of different projects together. I haven't used them a lot personally, but the one use case we are using them for is around tracking of permanence in particular. So doing annual cycles, remote sensing to track trees still standing, whether there's been a fire, and be able to like see that in real time and then act on it quickly. It's been one of the key things that's been implemented, but it's evolving very super quickly. Like, you know, there's people doing individual tags of trees that are now all on blockchain. So it's fully transparent. They can track every single tree. It's verified on chain. So there's some really interesting stuff that's going on in this space.
But in terms of what, like how much money or how much work hour does it save, like in general, the tool that you use compared to when you have to do it manually?
Yeah, I don't know the numbers exactly, but and you still do have to do some on-ground monitoring because you have to ground truth everything. I don't think they'll ever accept a fully remote monitoring as a definitive way of verifying carbon. I think there's always going to be some role for the on-ground monitoring. I don't know in terms of cost, but it does save a lot, just particularly in transport and just resource costs. If you have those dispersed projects I was talking about, just driving between all those sites and going to them is extremely cost intensive. I think one thing that's been interesting to weigh up too is like, because often communities get involved in the monitoring, and if we then move it all to digital, like what does that mean in terms of their ownership of that kind of activity too, which is an interesting thing to consider as well, which I think needs to play out.
Thanks, Al. It looks like we've time for one last question from Mariana. And just checking if this is a new question, because I know also you, Zarina was using your account to do a chat message earlier. So do you have a question now? Looks
think,
like it's just,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think she's just trying to unmute herself, but there are 3 Marianas I have in the in the call. So yeah. Louise just messaged me her question asking if you can say where you work and who for, to explain how to rate this global view that you have. So if you can.
Yeah, sure. So currently I work at a company called NatureCo, which is it's a global carbon developer for nature-based solutions projects. Yeah, I should say my views are my own and don't necessarily represent any of the organizations I've worked for. And before this, I worked for One Tree Planet, and I was leading their carbon program. So they were an international NGO based out of the US, but did projects all over the globe.
so it's really great that you have the freedom to express your own views. We're really glad you said that. Mapping out what is a complex field. So do we have a question from Mariana?
I see Harshini, is that you?
Yeah, may I?
Yes, please. I think we can have the last question. And yeah.
Okay. I found your presentation quite interesting because you mentioned at the initial slide itself that you're looking at it from a perspective where the voluntary carbon markets are driving the restoration projects around the world, whereas I was always thinking that the restoration projects drive the carbon market. So how does it really work? So this is an interesting perspective.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that now the demand very much sits within restoration and nature-based solutions. I think it's like the buzzword at the moment under the market. I think what I was trying to point out is that it's probably one of the main financial mechanisms to support restoration at the moment. And it has a lot of investment and capital that's going towards it. Outside of the usual, government and philanthropic ways restoration's been funded. So yeah, I think that's the point I was getting at there, but agree that it is really driving a lot of the conversation around particularly removals of carbon and how that is being adopted.
Yeah, but I think your take on it is actually quite practical in terms of getting more funding into this and making it possible, because often people listen to businesses more than they listen to scientists. I feel that's my experience. So I think the way you put it is quite apt, and I would, going forward, I would actually use that perspective to promote anything with regard to conservation and restoration. Thank you so much for that.
No, thank you.
So it looks like it's time to come to an end. I really want to thank Al again. It is a complex field, and there are many different ways of reading it. And you packed a lot in, and it was very, very insightful. And it was great when you brought forward some of the areas that you think need to be key priorities for work too. And thank you everybody who's been present here, both alumni, and we have at least 2 of our current students present. When I say at least 2, I don't know how many are sharing a screen at the moment, but it's lovely to see that interaction and the conversation happening, not just a Q&A. I also want to mention that regretfully, Shelley Balderson couldn't be with us here today because she's ill at the moment, but I know she will be thinking about us all and wishing the Notes from the Field a very, very good future going on from here. So thank you very much for everybody who's taken part, including Albina, who's been there doing all the necessary technical stuff too.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Alastair, for the presentation. And I'll see you on the next one, I guess. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Questions? Thanks. Bye.
Bye.